Hello and welcome back to this damnfully dualistic crusade. This video will be a quick book review of one of the essential tomes of film history and the technical aspects of motion picture making and the motion picture industry. This was written and published in 1992 and is still really the essential tome on the subject, and that is John Belton's Widescreen Cinema. This is about the development of not only the widescreen processes, but the economic factors and the political factors in the studio system that led to the creation and adoption of the widescreen formats and essentially the widescreen wars and boom of widescreen taking over the film industry in the 1950s. However, its most important aspects go far beyond that. Not only do you get a very detailed breakdowns about the development and technical aspects of Cinerama and CinemaScope and VistaVision and the studios adopting different ratios, but you also get very detailed explanations of the other important aspect of the widescreen revolution, which was multi-track stereophonic sound. And crucially, the sad truth that the studios and theater exhibitors, after a very short time, decided that stereophonic sound was not as important as just having a wider image to compete against television. But also Belton goes into the whole history and development of not just widescreen processes and widescreen imagery, but also the development of the 35mm standard. So this is just a priceless, incredible tome about the whole technical history of really motion picture photography itself. It is loaded with stills. It goes all the way back to the development of the silent days and film speeds and getting to 24 frames per second as a standard and eventually setting up the Academy ratio. So there is great discussion about the changeover to Academy ratio and getting that standardized. There are sections on Edison and the development of course, the development of sound out of silent films and what that did to the actual technical aspects of eventually setting up what became known as the Academy standard. But he also talks about the early attempts at widescreen. Of course, he of course talks about Abel Gance's Napoleon in 1927 with its incredible polyvision triptych, 3 panels of imagery, almost like a sort of early attempt at Cinerama without knowing Cinerama was going to be a thing, and the amazing aspects of seeing that theatrically. But of course, that was only for the selected sequences and the finale, really. But then he also talks about the other attempts that always seem to get glossed over. So the early attempts at 70mm and larger formats than 35mm and all kinds of different gauges too, because it wasn't just, oh, we'll just double it. No, they tried all kinds of different things. He even talks about the Magnavision process, which is really fascinating, which is basically a sort of blowing up of a standard 35mm image to a larger size for certain sequences, and of course the problems that would entail, which you see and what you would have seen here in old Ironsides, for example. This is the Kino Blu-ray. Unfortunately, it does not replicate that, but that was actually something I had forgotten about. But he goes over absolutely everything, and the book itself goes beyond just talking about the technical aspects. He does talk some about the films and the technical problems, but and very technical details, but also the history of them and the economic factors which really played into all of this, and that's of course what controls everything. So it's a fascinating way to finally understand how widescreen took hold, and it is loaded with stills that are extremely helpful and important in understanding the technical aspects, and also classic images like this, talking about the infamous CinemaScope mumps and what you had to do in order to correct in terms of the distortion inherent in the original CinemaScope lenses, which is why Panavision took off and superseded CinemaScope entirely, except for the fact that Fox had their contract and stuck with CinemaScope until In Like Flint in 1967, so they kept going, and that sort of became the de facto Fox look, everybody having the CinemaScope mump faces. But there is an entire section, obviously, on CinemaScope and Cinerama, those being the two formats that really primarily kicked everything off. But this is Cinerama in 1952, and Fox coming out with CinemaScope and The Robe in 1953, which also had 4 4-track magnetic stereo in the premiere engagements to compete with the 6-track multi-channel Cinerama stereo audio, and then how all the other studios sort of squabbled around and tried to come up with their own competing attempts and their own house ratios, and how if you look at this stuff, you can see how it all filtered down and eventually became the standards that we know. It's all here, and Belton does a fantastic job at going over and setting up the building blocks of how this stuff happens. So he talks about the Fox grandeur process in the early 30s and the large format process photography, basically a 70 millimeter feature, most famously used in The Big Trail, the Raoul Walsh directed classic Western that unfortunately didn't do well at the box office and sort of helped to sink Westerns for a while, and definitely sunk 70 millimeter process and John Wayne's career for pretty much the most of the 1930s. So, and it's fascinating that the large version, the 70 millimeter version of that film has survived, and you can actually watch it on Blu-ray. It's an absolute historical treasure, that film in its large format version. But he also talks about the theaters themselves and how they had to worry about conversion and what the exhibitors were saying. And so when each new format came along, he talks about what the theaters would have to do, what they would pay for, what they didn't want to pay for, how the studios tried to sell things, and how the studios tried to push different things. And then when a new format would come along, it just kept this widescreen format war sort of going. Several formats were really technological game changers, Cinerama being the key one that kick-started this whole revolution off in 1952. Then you had CinemaScope. Then you had eventually Mike Todd developing the Todd AO system, which sort of pioneered a lot of what we think of in the 70 millimeter format. But of course, Todd AO also had the higher frame rate for better stability, which meant that it didn't necessarily work with all standard theaters, and there was a lot more technical know-how that had to go into making that system work. And then in contrast to all of this, Paramount comes out with their VistaVision system, which had great fidelity by running the film horizontally, meaning you could photograph a much higher quality image and have a standard flat ratio and have different ratios. You could frame it different ways, from 1:66 up to 1:85 or 2.0 to 1. So it was a bit more of an open-ended system that would work, but also give you a widescreen high fidelity image, and you also didn't have to worry about building a scope screen and tearing out the whole front of your theater. So different studios tried different things. It's also fun to read about in the CinemaScope section how Fox and Warner Brothers were basically scheming to get the patent and get the contract to do CinemaScope, and Fox basically beat Warner Brothers to the punch, just barely. And then Warner Brothers tried to do their own thing for a while, and then eventually threw in the towel, and a lot of people signed on with Fox, and that's how CinemaScope became more widespread. But it's fascinating to read this stuff and finally understand how all of this came to be and how each studio sort of did their own thing. But he also, Belton talks about, it starts to read in sections like a sociology paper, because he talks about the theater going habits of the public and how that changed over time with the increasing competition, and of course the post-war period and the collapse of the studio system. And then he gets into quite a bit about how the technology advanced and then just sort of became very much standardized by the time of the 70s into the 80s, and then the rise of the multiplex. It's unfortunate there isn't an updated version. This was done in 1992. It's still invaluable, but I would love to have like a second part where he talks about film presentation in the 1990s, and I would love somebody to write a book about the digital sound wars of the 1990s between Dolby DTS and Sony's SDDS system, along with the sort of game-changing CDS Cinema Digital Sound System, the 5.1 birth that really was what killed off 70 millimeter roadshows and blow-up engagements. You get plenty of information about the classic roadshow presentations and the different formats they came in this book. This is absolutely invaluable, but again, you read it and you wish it went on longer. Here's, of course, the classic illustration of, oh, this is what CinemaScope's going to look like. Look at the robe. It's like Cinerama, but cheaper. And of course, it was amazing, but it was not as as hyped up as all of these incredible PR paintings would have you believe it. So the book is filled with those as well. And then most fascinating are, of course, the technical diagrams that they were working on, where they were trying to standardize things. And again, my personal favorite part from a technical aspect is, of course, reading about how the 35 millimeter and 70 millimeter standards were established, but also on the sound front, because the widescreen revolution was where you first had the major engagements and presentations of films in anything that wasn't standard mono sound from an optical track. This is when magnetic audio first started coming into play, which was a huge fidelity increase, and is something that most people are unfortunately unaware of, and something that has definitely gotten lost to time. I still myself would love to someday see a film run with magnetic sound, but it was such a fidelity increase and such a part of selling widescreen and the roadshow experience to people that it's really a shame and unfortunate that exhibitors and studios really decided they didn't want to pay for it, and that widescreen would be enough and just fine. And the really sad truth is a lot of these films, these really groundbreaking multi-channel stereo mixes, have been lost to time. Very few are preserved on restorations and releases. Usually it's the mono version that was designed for the general release that would happen later that survives, or they've lost parts of the track, and so they only have certain pieces that survive. So it's amazing when you can actually hear one of these original 4-track or 6-track magnetic stereo mixes if they survive and are preserved. And of course, sometimes the mono versions could be different, but usually the widescreen films would have 2 different mixes, just like they would have a big, large format roadshow version for the premiere engagements. Then they would have to make a standard 35 millimeter reduction or general release version, frequently shortened if it was a longer film, with either a 4-track stereo or just a plain mono soundtrack. So he goes over absolutely everything. This is a textbook. It is still frequently used as a textbook. It's from the Harvard University Press. So there are times where it does sort of read like a textbook. The opening and closing kind of feels like a thesis paper in terms of how it's written. So don't let that put you off if you're not really into reading very academic critical works. But once you get into it, you suddenly turn the page and get beautiful old style publicity stills like this iconic whimsical shot. It's really well done, even though it doesn't have a high page count. There's so much technical details that are gone over that it's still this is going to be a book you want to have on the shelf, so you can pore over it over and over again and thumb through for a reference about Magnoscope or 4-track mag stereo on CinemaScope films, or you want to double check something about Cinerama. But especially getting into the nitty gritty of this stuff is why this book is so important. I really hope somebody does an updated version of this at some point, but until then, this is one of the essential film reference books. You can get it for a pretty cheap price, and occasionally you spot it in a bookstore, or it's in a college course reading list, or it's an actual textbook. This particular copy, which I bought a number of years ago, has a sticker on the back that seems to indicate that it perhaps did go through a college book sale, because it looks like one of those stickers you would get on a used textbook. It is a soft cover, and it is a bit whiter. Of course, widescreen cinema, the book itself, it's a bit whiter. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It has pretty big margins on the sides, but some of the images are a little bit bigger. But I think the idea was to just have a wider book because it was widescreen cinema. So, of course, you open the book and it's got wraparound art too. This is, of course, depicting the iconic industry-changing moment of This Is Cinerama in 1952, when you get the experience of riding the roller coaster in the most iconic part of the first Cinerama travelogue. So basically, if you ever wanted to know anything about the technical details of not just widescreen, but motion picture sound, and how all this stuff developed, and how the studio system decided to finally change to a different format style of exhibition. If you wanted to know more about the classic roadshow films, the different processes, how 24 frames per second became a standard from the varying frame rates and film speeds of the silent days. If you wanted to know how the Academy ratio was set up, if you wanted to know how 4perf 35 millimeter was established as a standard, or 65 millimeter with the additional space given for magnetic stereo to then make 70 millimeter. If you ever wondered how any of this stuff got started, why we have the 2:3:5 to 1 scope ratio instead of the original 2.55 to 1 scope ratio that Fox started with, why is magnetic stereo important? Why did we ever change over from optical? How did Cinerama get off the ground? How did VistaVision get off the ground? What's up with the different ratios? What's up with the different ratios for different studios in terms of having a house widescreen ratio? All of that is here. This is a vital, essential reference work. It's one of the essential film books for every cinephile to have on their reference shelf. This is a book you will pull off the shelf and want to thumb through forever. It is that important of a reference work. And I think every cinephile should have a copy of this, or at least read it once, because this is basically the ultimate crash course in the technical development of film from the silent days to the widescreen revolution of the 50s and beyond. Again, the only downside is that it pretty much stops in the early 90s when the book was written. So that's why I think this is so important. It's an invaluable resource, and you get a bunch of great illustrative stills from different films and classic PR materials. But you also get very important diagrams to really illustrate the very technical aspects this book gets into. So don't be put off when it starts getting into the tech stuff if you're not technologically oriented or you don't know a lot about film formats, because the book does a great job of explaining each process and system that it brings up and how it worked, and then you get really helpful diagrams if you still can't quite visualize what it's talking about. So this is John Belton's Widescreen Cinema, one of the essential film reference books for any film bookshelf. Again, if you haven't read this at least once, get a copy from a library, pour over it. You won't be able to put it down. It really is unrivaled in terms of books about the technological development of motion picture making and the industry itself and the actual formats. This is the book. There are some other books that touch on the subject. There are some other books that go into some of this stuff, or maybe one of the formats, but again, this is still the book on the development of widescreen as a system, as a technology, as a game changer for the industry forever, and it is one of the essential film reference books. So that's it for this book review. Again, I just wanted to, I reread this recently, and I wanted to spotlight this book in particular because it is that important, and it's something I think every cinephile or just general film fan should read to get a better understanding of widescreen cinema, and it is truly that important. So if you've read Belton's Widescreen Cinema, or this sounds interesting to you, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, keep reading print books, keep supporting your local independent bookstores, and thanks ever so much for watching.